Good evening. Thank you for joining us for the latest installment in our Healthy Communities Conversation series. I'm Phil Goropoulos, president of CHI St. Joseph Children's Health. As we've talked about in the past, this series was started as a part of our effort to better understand what it means to have and create a healthy community, not just from the beginnings of what the origins are, but then how do we maintain that and grow from there. The challenge has always been about defining what it means to be a healthy community. It's easy to say we're going to create one, but then when it comes down to building blocks, that's where the challenge really starts to be going. And how we go about doing the work to make that a reality. This series has helped us learn from others, both locally and nationally, what that is, how they're calling and how their work has kind of shaped their images about what this could be and what we could create and the beautiful world that we can have together. Today, I'm honored to have as our guest, Father James Martin. He's been a personal hero of mine as I've read through his books over the years. I've been trying to get him to come to Lancaster to work with our team for a number of years, and this is the first opportunity we've had to be able to talk. He was one of the individuals offering closing prayers at the Democratic National Convention this past summer, and you may know him from one of his many books, including Jesus, a Pilgrimage, which we've used here locally as a reflective piece for our staff as they've gone on mission trips, as well as Building a Bridge, which is about the connections between the Catholic Church and the LGBT community. So happy to have Father James Martin join us this afternoon for our conversation. Welcome, Father Martin.
My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
So I want to start out, as a part of Common Spirit Health and Catholic Health Initiatives, CHI, St. Joseph Children's Health, and all of our ministries across the country have been called, and we call and refer to ourselves as champions for the common good in our local community. This is central, to our personality, how we approach our services and our communities, and it's driven also by being keenly aware about the unique needs and challenges facing the poor and vulnerable in our local communities. We kind of have always viewed this as consistent with our Catholic health ministry, but also at the heart of Catholic social teaching within all of our dioceses across the world. Pope Francis often reminds us of our calling to care for those who are less fortunate and to create systems that recognize needs and uplift the dignity of those who are most vulnerable in our community. In this time where it's become very political around everything, it seems like in the United States, we'll become very focused on the me as opposed and the what do I get out of this as opposed to the idea of a common good. I wonder if you could reflect a little bit upon the challenges of and how we can use, in essence, the church and other institutions to help rebuild that commitment within our communities to this concept of the common good and advancing all of us.
I think that's a great question because I think oftentimes the common good can run head on into this American idea of our rights and what is due to me, right? And it's look, I'm a capitalist. I went to the Wharton School of Business and worked for General Electric for a couple of years, so I'm a capitalist, and I believe that the capitalist system is the most efficient way of delivering goods and services. I just do. But it's not perfect. And I think one of the things that makes it not perfect is this emphasis on kind of the individual. And there's not as much in terms of a focus on the common good. And the common good, as you said, which is at the center, one of the central tenets of Catholic social teaching, is saying that there's something more than what we take from the economy or what we take from culture or from society. We have to give to the community, basically. I mean, something simple as like public transportation is something that is important for the common good. I mean, not everybody takes the subway or the bus or the local SEPTA train, but it is something that exists for the whole community, and it is something that individuals contribute for the good of the whole community. Something like our water system, sewers, electricity, right? I mean, so that's an idea I think that gets sometimes lost in the American capitalist system. And I think more of an emphasis on the common good, helps everybody. And again, that is antithetical sometimes to the capitalist system where everything's about, what can I afford? And the people who work harder get more money and they should be able to afford more things. And there's a certain basic level of goods and services that should be available to everyone, even, as you say, the most vulnerable. And so I think it's a really essential thing for particularly Americans to grapple with today.
One thing I thought that was interesting that I think COVID really highlighted was, we talk about safety net and basic safety net services. And one of the things that I was raising in our local community, particularly with foundations and funders in the local area, was that, COVID kind of redefined the safety net and what is the safety net, because now, traditionally, like if you were going to qualify for certain services, you had to basically prove how poor you were or how in need you were. And now all of a sudden you had households that, traditionally may have been able to make it, who lost everything, but didn't have the records to prove that they could no longer afford their housing, and they're left in this kind of lurch of nowhere, that we don't have a place for them. That's one of the things that I guess I wish, really hope that we have a further conversation as we start to emerge out of the pandemic, is like, what is a safety net really, and how do we make sure that, that when there are temporary blips, hopefully temporary, like the pandemic has created, that we can stop people from falling, and we can kind of help them stay where they are. And that stability is important, as well as, just the basics sometimes.
I think that's right, because I think that the COVID pandemic has shown people, how important it is to have those goods and services for people. And, there's a certain American idea that, well, if you're poor and you're vulnerable, it's your fault, basically. And I think the coronavirus shows us that, a lot of times it's not our fault. In many cases, it's not our fault. And so people who are poor and vulnerable should not be punished further, for having the misfortune of being sick or disabled or born into poverty. I mean, I think that's another, in a sense, that's a handicap or a disability that people need to understand. And I think that COVID is a kind of great equalizer too, right? I mean, everybody is struggling, and everybody sees now the need for some sort of basic social services. So for example, let's take a crazy example. Let's say that there was a vaccine, but only rich people could afford it. People would say, well, that's not fair. Everybody needs a vaccine. But in a lot of cases, as you know, I mean, that's the situation with public health, right? I mean, there's such big disparities. And so again, this is the idea of the common good, a basic level of goods and services, which also relates to another teaching of Catholic social teaching, which is the dignity of every person. So people deserve, the dignity of healthcare, of food, of clean water, right? Pope Francis talks a lot about this in Laudato Si. So it's a different vision of society than I have to say that. And look, I'm patriotic, and I'm a patriotic capitalist, but American culture, I think, and American society, I think, has missed out on that. We have the whole, not to get too controversial, but the whole topic of masks, wearing masks, right? I mean, that's essentially for the common good. And some people say, no, you can't infringe upon my personal rights. Well, that's where rights versus the common good kind of come into conflict. And it's pretty clear what Catholic social teaching has to say. It's more about the common good.
Yeah, I mean, I agree entirely. And actually, through our conversation we had with Sister Mary Haddad from the Catholic Health Association, we were talking about the politicization of masks, and then the challenges that I think communities are facing. And then you actually even see this within my daughter's own school, where you're weighing the individual rights of a single individual who's refusing to wear the mask versus the safety of the rest of the classroom.
Right.
And where is the line, and how, to me, it's a no-brainer. Like you have to figure something out to accommodate that child who is refusing to wear a mask, but you can't do it at the risk of the entire group. So what are the options? But we kind of lost that, in essence, somewhat moral compass about, the goods of the whole versus the goods of the individual.
Yeah, and I think it's sad that it's been politicized. I often try to give people an example of taking it out of the whole masks and COVID and Democrat, Republican, liberal, conservative, and to say, if you were, visiting someone in a hospital and you had measles, and they said to you, you can't visit a certain ward because there's pregnant women in there or something like that, expectant mothers. I mean, unless you're a monster, you wouldn't say, you're infringing upon my rights. I will go in and meet these expectant mothers, and I will walk through this, wing, despite what you say. People would say, no, that's monstrous. And yet on a different level, I think that's what people are doing with the masks. I mean, I understand it's inconvenient, and, but it's again, it's the individual right versus the common good. And there's a certain sacrifice there that people are asked to make. It's the same kind of sacrifice that you're asked to make for the sewers and electricity and public transportation. Some of your tax dollars go to, since we're, talking about Pennsylvania, go to SEPTA, right? Or go to, the local buses and wherever you are. in your community. Now, you may never take SEPTA or never take the bus. You may have a car, but most people say, well, I understand what this is for. It's for, you know, it's for the whole community. It's the same thing. It's the same kind of need to sacrifice a little bit for the common good.
One thing
So
I
I'm not
think
sure. I'm not sure. I think it's because it's been politicized. I think if it were handled a different way, and in a sense, people were invited to see this as something that's an act of charity, basically, it would be a lot different. But unfortunately, it's been so politicized. It's really incendiary.
and the extremes, I think that's what's, I think, scary to me, is to watch the reactions, and then the people that are, you know, again, the most underpaid, underrepresented people getting, you know, attacked in stores and other places by simply asking people to put on a mask. Is really, that's, you know, I mean, the mask decision is one thing, and then the inciting to violence over a simple question of a piece of cloth is really,
especially often, as you're saying, often people who are themselves poor and vulnerable, you know, who are working in these jobs that are low paying. You know, I heard something really powerful the other day that said that, you know, at the beginning it was all about essential workers, and I read an interview with one guy who said essential means sacrificial, right? I mean,
many
there's
of those positions,
people who can, you know, telecommute and, you know, do Zoom calls and do their things from home, and there are people that cannot, and in a sense, it's a kind of double penalty, right? I mean, they're not only poor, but they have to, in a sense, put up with people who aren't being healthy around them. So it's really sad. I mean, it's a real,
no ability to stand up for themselves, really, without consequence. Something that I think, you know, came to grips during COVID, we're seeing a further awakening, is that the idea and the impact of systemic racism. I know you've talked about it within your Twitter feed and on Facebook posts. To me, I thought it was interesting, and again, Sister Mary and I talked a little bit about this, that we were starting to have some of this conversation, you know, within the primary process, where for the first time ever, I can remember, you know, major party candidates actually talking about health disparities impacting African-American women. And it wasn't just like an aside conversation, but on the main debate stage. But really, you know, the killing of George Floyd really brought to light, you know, what's going on after we've seen image after image after image of this continually happening to members of the African-American community. You know, you've called for us to do more to care for our brothers and sisters who have been heavily impacted by illness and loss of income and various other threats. You also called for us to recognize the evil of racism. I think, again, you know, Pope Francis has done, I think, a pretty spectacular job bringing that up within our own health system. Our CEO, Lloyd Dean, has put out a very strong statement and continues to challenge us to address it within our own local markets and local communities. You framed it in particular, and this is what I found interesting. I think you and Dan Horan as well has also been raising this, that this is a pro-life issue. Like this our response to COVID, our response to these evils that we're seeing in our community are pro-life, and that being pro-life means going so far beyond what has become the definition in the United States as being, you know, in favor of choice or in favor of banning abortion, and that we need to have that larger definition of pro-life to be fully inclusive of all that we're called to and celebrating the dignity of life. Could you expand a little bit upon like your definition of pro-life and how we can get people to have a greater understanding of what that issue means?
Sure, it's a great question. I mean, being pro-life means being pro all lives, not just being pro some lives. Of course, you know, for the Catholic Church, the preeminent life issue is the unborn child in the womb. And you know, I reverence that unborn child in the womb as a gift from God. But it doesn't stop there. And I think that's the problem with a lot of people's conception of pro-life. You know, life begins at conception, but it doesn't end there. And so there's a whole constellation of issues that come up. Even something that you've been mentioned, but I'm sure you feel the same way. You know, war and peace, issues of war and peace. I mean, you know, people are dying in wars, and so obviously that's a life issue. Mm-hmm. It's funny though, when you bring that up to people, they feel like you're somehow watering things down. But Pope Francis said our defense for the unborn should be, I think, something like clear, firm, and passionate. Equally sacred, however, are these other issues, right? And he talked about poverty and you know, refugees and migration. So what is it? It means every life is sacred. So that means the unborn child in the womb, but the poor child in the inner city, right? Whose parents don't have health care, or the homeless man on the street who's starving, or a woman on the street, the refugee or migrant. I mean, there's something like 26 million refugees, 45 million internally displaced people. Questions of suicide, right? I do a lot of work around LGBTQ youth. The death penalty, right? There's clearly a life and death issue. But in terms of racism, it's recognizing not only that a lot of Black men and women fear for their own lives in their own neighborhoods, which we've seen over and over again. If people have any doubt, they see these videos, but also in terms of healthcare, right? Inner city people who are poor, who are unemployed or underemployed, who don't have access to good healthcare, their lives are at risk, right? And that's why you see these kind of soaring rates of death among, for example, like middle-aged Black men, right? I mean, because of lack of health care and so pro-life is pro all life, right? Pro all human life, and it's how do we, again, going back to the common good, care for everybody, care for our brothers and sisters. So it's more than just the unborn child.
It is interesting to watch people's reactions when you bring up issues like we're talking about right now. I mean, one of the examples, I mean, behind me is a icon of St. Therese by Kelly Lattimore.
My hero.
One of the images that we selected of his for inclusion in our Healthy Columbia space was I think it's a newer image that he created that was Mary and Jesus behind a wire fence. And I raised it to our vice president here. I said, how offended do you think people are going to get by this? And she goes, I think there will be some. I said, well, good, because they need to be. Because there's that huge disconnect, even within our own local community, of like how much do people deserve versus how much they get. And when you raise that issue, like you can have a very firm person who believes in anti-abortion, who at the same time won't give $5 to the food bank because those people should work. It's such a disconnect to me.
Well, it is a disconnect. And you think, look, in terms of like working hard, who works harder, the hedge fund manager or the unemployed, the underemployed single woman who has to have 3 jobs? And I mean, who works harder physically? Who works harder in terms of hours? And no one talks about that in terms of deserving, right? How did the hedge fund manager get there? Was it purely, hard work, or was it because his parents, sent him to a good school and he had good prep schools? And so, I think that whole thing about deserving is a little is usually ignores some of the backgrounds of these people, right? I mean, if you're born into a wealthy family on the main line outside of Philadelphia, and you go to all these prep schools, and then you go to Penn or Princeton, and you get into a hedge fund, versus you're born in the inner city in, North Philadelphia, and you don't have good education. Both of these people could still be working just as hard as one another. Let's say they're working equally hard. Who's going to do better, financially? Probably the person who went to the prep schools through no sort of hard work. I mean, okay, his parents did that, but so that's what we talk about systems, right? Systemic. And it's amazing that kind of, I think the American reliance on, I did this all by myself, is there was a great comeback to that. It was, I forget, a couple of years ago. It's a good thing I don't remember who said this, but they said, I did it all on my own. I went to the public library and I studied, and I took the public transportation and did it on my own. And I sort of pulled myself up by the bootstraps. And someone said, well, who do you think funded the public library and the public transportation system? I mean, it's not just you. So we have to get back to this sense of interconnectedness. To get to your point, though, I do struggle with people who think that, the lives of homeless people, the lives of refugees and migrants are somehow less important than the life of the unborn child. I have never gotten that. But it's very common, refugees, oh, well, that, they should stay in their own countries. And I worked with refugees in East Africa for 2 years, and, these people are fleeing for a reason. People don't leave their homes for no good reason. Mm-hmm. So it's an American focus on individual rights. It's a kind of misguided understanding of what it means to work hard and succeed. And I think a little bit of his selfishness.
And the divide isn't always like town to town or even like North Philly to Center City. I mean, we had David Goreski come from Stanford Center for Poverty a couple of years ago to speak to our staff, and he was talking about within Palo Alto, which is a pretty wealthy community, just
Right.
by crossing the street, your
Sure.
kids' opportunities decline significantly from street to street, and even from
Right.
side of the street to side of the street. That it creates that part of his argument was around when poverty and wage gaps was around opportunity gap. It's all about the amount of opportunity that we can provide to people, and it shouldn't be driven by geography or your parents' income. If we're truly the land of opportunity, where we want people to succeed on their merits, we've got to give them a basic level of opportunity to start so that we all have a kind of level playing field.
I agree. And it's so insidious because people tend not to see that. They think that they got ahead only on their own, right? And that the other people who are poor or unemployed or underemployed somehow are deserving of that because they're not working hard enough.
Mm-hmm.
There's a great book by Barbara Ehrenreich, a social critic, called Nickel and Dime to Death. And
Mm-hmm.
she tries to make ends meet on basically the minimum wage. And she can't do it. And she's working, I think, like 3 jobs. It's an experiment for her. She's a writer, and it's really instructive. So this idea that they're not, quote unquote, working hard enough, or they're not working hard in school. If you're in a school with not a lot of resources, you simply are not, as you say, going to have the same opportunities. And so, again, you would think that this would make people more generous, but it sometimes makes them less generous.
And it's interesting to watch even how we set up our wage systems. I think we're very proud of it. I think something Tom Coffensteiner and I talk about a lot is around social justice doesn't end at your doorstep. It also is in your own house, and how we treat and how we pay our employees is part of a reflection of that. And so, I know I've had multiple debates because everybody wants to be competitive. You want to make sure you're paying what everybody else is paying for something. So we actually just recently created, first time ever, because of the extra steps we had to take because of COVID, an environmental services associate position here. So I'd never heard of that title before, but when I went through our process, that's what they say it's called now. And then they told me what the acceptable pay range was based upon our market of Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And I said, well, that's not acceptable to me. And they're like, well, that's what the data shows. And I said, well, no one here is going to earn that, especially if they're, putting themselves at risk for us to be healthier. And I had to argue with them, and they made the change because ultimately, I guess I make some of the decisions around. They let me pretend to make some of the decisions around here. But we're going to make a notation in here that the data doesn't support what you're recommending. And I was like, well, that's fine, because it's not about the data, it's about just, and it's not just to pay someone like that. And we're
what's a just wage? I mean, again, speaking as a Wharton grad, we tend to think that the only measure of something is supply and demand.
Yeah.
Okay, well, this is what the market pays. Well, so what?
Yeah.
I mean, is it just? Does it make sense? Is it a living wage?
Yeah.
So it's an amazing thing. And I think, one of the things I think is really instructive for Catholic organizations or Christian organizations is that the more our boards are run by people who come from the corporate world, the more that they think, and even Christian organizations start to think that the market is the only way to make those judgments. And that's false. I mean, you look at the woman behind you, Thérèse of Lisieux.
Yeah.
The way she made judgments about her life was not based on the market. And you could say, well, she lived in a capitalist society too, and she, supply and demand. And so it's seeing that there are other ways, or at least there are other, let's just say, factors that should be included in decision making.
So one of the things I wanted to make sure we touched on was in your book, not your latest book, because your newest book is coming out soon, on the art of prayer.
It's right behind me on my desk. That's the galleys, actually.
So if we look close enough, we can get a sneak peek.
Yeah, right.
But the Building Bridges book, which to me, when it came out, was like a no-brainer. And I mean, as a disclosure, I worked in AIDS and LGBT health prior to coming to Common Spirit and CHI. So it was always like front and center for me was the relationship the LGBTQ community has with the church. And it was one of the issues that I had to resolve before I could come here. Was like I had worked in a very pro-LGBT community, had worked to affirm and uplift the dignity of that population. How did I feel coming to a Catholic organization? And there were certain cues that I was looking for to make sure that I knew that my values aligned and would be supported here. And I found those. Obviously, I wouldn't be here. But the book calls for, building that understanding and compassion and support between the LGBT community. I thought there was the great podcast series, The Plague, that was put out by American Magazine. I thought also did it in the context of AIDS, but also talked about kind of some priests and nuns building that bridge even from the 80s and on. But to me, what was most disturbing is I think the book is fabulous. I think it's the right direction. Was the reaction that you saw in the community, and that you, in essence, were receiving death threats and had speaking engagements canceled because you had taken this position basically saying we should embrace and we should welcome our brothers and sisters and we should find ways to be supportive of one another, which to me, again, it seems like common sense. But it was so kind of radical at the time, which was only like 2-3 years ago. So it wasn't that long.
Yeah.
Like I talk about like it was ancient history.
Yeah, 4 years ago, right. About 3 years ago.
So, first, thank you for speaking out for the LGBT community, because I think so often they are forgotten in conversations of faith, and many of them are such deep people of faith that really have tremendous faith and have endured so much just to be able to continue to celebrate.
That's right. Faith. Yeah. I mean, they have to really want to be in the church to stay. So, as an organization, we were very clear on discrimination statement. We put out, it was interesting. To me, it was like weird because we were having a conversation with the Borough of Columbia, because we're going to be we're renovating and running their farmers market for them to try to bring that back to the community. And one of the people in the meeting asked, we have to ask because you're a Catholic organization, if a gay couple wanted to rent a vendor booth from you at the market, would you deny them? And I was like, I had to look around. I was like, who are you talking to? And I was like, of course not. Like, this is all of our mission. I always go back to we're Franciscans, so we're about affirming and loving everyone. We're bringing people up. So what are some concrete steps that local, congregants can take, priests can take to be able to kind of start laying that framework to make it welcoming? I mean, I think Pope Francis kind of laid some groundwork this past weekend, where he said, that parents of LGBT kids should love their kids because God loves them just the way they are. And I was super excited to hear him make that. Oh, it's amazing. And even the situation that you described, where people even have to ask that question, would a gay couple be welcome? Frankly, in some dioceses, they would not be welcome to a farmer's market or to any sort of public thing that was sponsored by the Catholic Church, as if they're the only people that are not, adhering to the Catholic Church teaching. Would you say, are couples who use birth control allowed to have a farmer's market? Or how about people who are divorced? Or how about people that don't go to Sunday Mass? No one thinks to ask that question. And so it's this kind of targeting. So what can people do? The first thing is to listen to them. Mm-hmm. That's the first thing. Listen to them. Listen to what their needs are, to what their hurts have been. It's hard to hear, I think, for Christians and Catholics, how churches have hurt people. And I think most people on this, who are watching this right now, are probably enlightened and open-minded. You would be amazed at some of the things that people have gone through, some of the things that LGBTQ people have gone through at the hands of religious leaders and churches, their own churches and their families. It's just, there's a reason why LGBT teen suicide is 5 times as high as that of straight kids. There's a reason for that, not only rejecting families, but also rejecting churches. So I would say listen to them. Second thing is be their friends, right? It's pretty basic Christian discipleship. Just be friends with them. Be friends with them, come to know them, and then finally advocate for them, right? So stand up for them, even when it's difficult. And I tell you, it was so odd to have the reactions to that book. Now, most of the reactions were very positive. At the beginning, when the book came out, there were kind of 3 waves. One was this kind of adulation, which was also surprising because the book, is basically, it's not challenging any church teaching. It's basically talking about treating these people with respect, compassion, and sensitivity. But then the second wave was these really kind of personal vilifications that's still going on. I always say to people, just Google James Martin LGBT and you see what comes up. You'll be kind of shocked. Canceled talks and yeah, death threats and terrible things online, name calling. I mean, every name in the book, kind of used to it by now. But then there was a third wave, which was the pushback to the pushback, which was cardinals and archbishops inviting me to give talks. I was invited by the Vatican to give a talk at the World Meeting of Families. And then I met with Pope Francis privately a year ago in a couple days, which was extraordinary. And so there is, you know, there are forces that are pushing, I think mainly who are pushing for, you know, this kind of welcome of the LGBT people. But I would say listen, be their friends, and advocate for them, and be willing to put up with some flack if you do.
Yeah. Yeah, so I always watch, and it's like you take one step forward and you make some real good progress, and then you read about things like in I guess it was Indianapolis with the teacher fired.
Or in Poland where they're saying it's a rainbow plague, and the bishops there are aligning themselves against, you know, they're treating them like enemies. They're saying that it's worse than Nazism. It's really unbelievable. There's a lot of homophobia out there. Fortunately, not as much in the United States, but it's still around. It's still around, and it's certainly around in the Catholic Church. That's for sure.
Mm-hmm. And then to see also priests that have come out that then kind of have been pushed a little bit to the sidelines. And I'm thinking of the iconographer out in New Mexico.
Bill McNichols, yeah.
Yeah, who they were featuring in that series, who then was told basically you're not going to be able to be placed anywhere.
Which is an irony because, you know, Catholic Church teaching is that LGBT people should be chaste, celibate, right? And that's exactly what these priests and nuns, I would add, and brothers are doing. I mean, there are many, many celibate, chaste Catholic priests and nuns who are doing great work. I always say to people, they probably baptized your children and given you communion and, you know, buried your parents and visited you in the hospitals and taught you, and you just don't know them, right? And yeah. It's really sad. So there is still this tremendous homophobia in the church, and that's one of the reasons I wrote the book.
One of the things that I recall, and it ties back to one of your other books about your life with the saints. You know, and I don't recall who said it, or if I read it, or someone had told me to it, that, you know, that we're all called to and have the ability to be a saint if we make that choice. And maybe it was you, I don't know.
Well, actually, it was a couple. Thomas Merton said, for me to be a saint means to be myself. The Second Vatican Council talked about the universal call to holiness. Mother Teresa said, it's our duty, you know. So yeah, it's a pretty common theme, but Thomas Merton, for me to be a saint means to be myself. Yeah.
Yeah, we tie a lot of Merton's teachings into our staff. I think our staff gets sick of it sometimes. And, introduced it to my board chair at the time was Presbyterian, and by the time he was done, he's like, well, I might be a Franciscan now. I'm not sure. And again, you know, I still keep sharing with him when things come up around, and particularly Merton's work, that he would be of interest because he really had a affinity for him. I was reflecting on him the other day with our current board chair, and, you know, when you think about it, so we lost so many people in '68 that, you know, the impact that those individuals could have continued to have on the world if they had made it out of that year.
Yeah, he was pretty young too. He was in his 50s.
So, I mean, I think, you know, for some people, and I think for our staff, like we have a couple of about 8 feast days that we celebrate here throughout the year tied to saints that have connection to our ministry. And I think sometimes our staff find it intimidating, you know, to look at these figures, whether they be more contemporary or more ancient, like St. Francis and St. Clare. But what they accomplished and what they did, you just read it and you're just like, wow, like that's, you know, I couldn't do that. I couldn't even approach that. And that's where I think Merton does make it more manageable for people. But how do you encourage people in the community, Catholic and non-Catholic? Because I do find, like, you know, my mom is not a Catholic, and I do find that, like, talking to her about, like, how we pull inspiration from these saints within our work and how we look to them for our courage, and they present somewhat archetypes of traits and characteristics we would want to embody. How do you encourage people to approach the lives of the saints, and then how can we use their examples to kind of march forward in this call to create healthier communities?
Well, the jokey answer is I asked them to read my book, My Life with the Saints. But, the book basically talks about them as being human. Like, look, let's take Thérèse of Lisieux behind you, right?
Mhm.
Thérèse of Lisieux led a fairly unremarkable life. She's very, pious young woman, a girl actually, when she sort of really started to, want to be holy in her own way. She enters a monastery, Carmelite monastery, which is why she's dressed like that, Carmelite habit. She doesn't do a whole lot. She prays, she tries to do simple tasks. Her way is called the little way because it's about doing little things with love. She puts up with her sisters who are her religious sisters in the convent. Also, her blood sister was the superior. And she puts up with an illness, early in life. I think she was 23 when she died, might be a little older. Kind of an unremarkable life, and yet she's one of the greatest saints. People say, oh, I could never do that. She tried to be holy in her own way. That's what John the 23rd said too. I'm not called to be Thérèse of Lisieux or Mother Teresa or Pope Francis or Francis of Assisi. I'm just called to be me and find holiness and be holy in my own way. And so I think it's interesting, Philip. I think one of the things that I suggest that people do is to read their real lives. And they say, oh, well, wait, they put up with a lot of stuff and had struggles and got sick and got discouraged and, were frustrated and not everything always went well for them. But when we idealize them, we put them on a pedestal, and we also let ourselves off the hook, mix a metaphor a little bit, because we say, oh, I could never be a saint, so I don't even have to try. But it's as Mother Teresa said, it's kind of our duty. So what would that mean for someone who's watching? It means that if you have someone who's a 45-year-old mother of 2 kids in school, your way to sanctity is to be a good mother and to be a good, or if you're also working outside the house, to be a good employer, to be a good wife. And I don't mean to focus it only on the family for women, but to be, if you're an attorney too, or a teacher, right, or or a physician, to be that and to be holy in those ways as well, right? And that's Merton's idea. For me to be holy means to be a saint. So it's not just for priests and people in religious orders and people in habits or collars. It's for people in suits and ties and overalls and, who have, if you're cleaning diapers, changing diapers and things like that, mowing the lawn and helping their neighbors and taking care of their older parents. And so that's, what's more holy, the young person who's taking care of a sick parent, right? Or even the middle-aged person who's taking care of a parent with Alzheimer's, or Thérèse of Lisieux. They're both holy. It's not better or worse. It's just different ways of being holy. So it's finding holiness in your own life. And it's kind of shocking for people because they say, well, I could never do that. Well, you're not supposed to do what Thérèse of Lisieux did. She already did it. And she probably couldn't do what you're doing. Mother Teresa might not have been the best mother, like parent.
Mm-hmm.
So it's holiness in your own way.
We raised that, like, one of the days that we celebrate is, we call it the spirituality of work, and it's around Labor Day. And I really try to emphasize to our staff that all work is holy. So just because we have psychiatrists and we have an environmental services associate, all of your work brings glory to God if you lift it up.
Absolutely. If you're doing it freely and if you're doing it, for God's glory, right? I mean, even the irony, like who helps people more? Did Thérèse of Lisieux help more people, or did the psychiatrist help more people? You could make a case that the psychiatrist directly helps more people. Now, of course, Thérèse helps people with her prayers and her example, of course. So, yeah, I mean, that's where you get into the comparisons, which I think are unhealthy, right? People say, well, my job isn't holy. Well, yeah, actually, yes, it is, no matter what you're doing. So and I think you're right, work has an important part of that. So that's where I think the universal call to holiness, I think, gets misunderstood.
I think some of the easy example, even with Saint Teresa, like her saying, like, we're called to love because that's really what we're meant to do. Like, everybody can do that.
Yep.
Like, for Francis, about recognizing the poor, I can't say that I would ever want to strip naked and give everything up and roam and help the poor that way. But you can help the poor in ways that are meaningful to yourself, and you're still seeing. And
you're also not supposed to do that because of your job now.
Yeah.
I mean, you're obviously not supposed to strip naked, but you're not supposed to sort of run off and leave everything. You got a job now, right?
Yeah.
And it's a fundamental misunderstanding of what holiness means. it's a misunderstanding of the saints. It's also a misunderstanding of, you know, the way that Jesus was holy, right? Fully human and fully divine. We forget the human part. You know, look, the earliest saints. I mean, Saint Peter. I mean, he was kind of screwed up,
Yeah.
you know, but God still called. Jesus still called him, even with his many sins. You know, that even he admits. I mean, he denies Jesus, denies even knowing him, and God's able to work through that. So I think if God can work through St. Peter, God can work through all of us.
So within, you know, these kind of difficult times, both even before COVID, it was kind of a dark time for many people.
Right.
You know, I always like to say that there's a great opportunity that's waiting to be found and unleashed when we respond to challenges in the appropriate way. You know, and it's hard for us to not, you know, get down or depressed or feel defeated sometimes. But that we have the ability to shape the future. I think something that I continuously quote to my staff is Bobby Kennedy's quote around that the future is not a guarantee, it's an achievement. And if we don't work towards it, we don't achieve that. And then we don't get the future that we deserve because it's not going to just be handed to us. So, you know, of this, you know, period, there's so many, I think, important opportunities for us to kind of identify. What would you say would be the most important opportunities for change that we have coming around to us, and where do you see the most hope within a time that for some people is struggling to find hope?
I think the most important thing is not to go back, is the common good, is this idea of the common good and the notion that we are all in this together. And I think nothing has taught us that as much as COVID. Everyone is around the world, everyone is concerned about this. And so therefore it's an invitation for us to pool our resources together and to try to do something together. I do think that, you know, one of the things that has come out of this, I don't want to say it's a silver lining, but is this emphasis on what's important, right? I think that people who have not been able to see their families, you know, are missing that. They recognize how important that is. People who have not been able to connect with their friends. People who have not actually been able to connect with their coworkers. I think it heightens a sense of desire for human relationship. And I think that's a good thing. I mean, that people are aware of that now, and that, you know, there are some things that we've been taking for granted that I hope it continues. I mean, you know, human beings are good at forgetting things. And, you know, Gore Vidal once called, you know, the United States of amnesia. I remember back in 9/11, people, I'm sure you remember, you're much younger than I am, but people said everything's going to change, nothing's going to be the same. Well, you know,
Airport
so I hope that we
changed. Yeah.
What's that?
Airport security changed.
Yeah. But I hope that we are able to learn something from all of this. We'll see.
What role do you think the church can play in helping to assure that we learn something from this?
Well, I think Pope Francis has done a great job of pointing us towards that. He said earlier that a couple of months ago that the pandemic is not a judgment on us. It's not God's judgment, but it's our invitation to judge what's important, right? What's really important. I think that the church, I mean, obviously can reach out pastorally to people, but I think it is providing that sense of community and that sense of common purpose, right? Which I think the church does very well in its best days.
Yeah. One of the things that I particularly enjoyed, like I said, we used your book, Jesus, a Pilgrimage, when first couple of years that I was here, we would send a couple of employees on a service learning trip for a week, and we would use your study guide and the book as kind of their study during the week to reflect back upon your words and then tie it back to our mission and purpose here. Was that, you know, you took us on your trip. I remember thinking when I first heard about the book, I was like, this is kind of a weird concept, like how is Jesus a pilgrimage? And then I started to read through it, and it makes so much sense because you feel the presence in the structures and the places, and it has that kind of, it's not really the right word for it, but like the residual memory of space.
Oh yeah, sure, that makes sense, yeah.
And you know, I wonder, like within, you know, we just built a school in Columbia, and we put a lot of time and thought into the structure of it. When so much now is built so quickly and for a purpose that I think we forget kind of almost like the the holiness of spaces, that you can create this feeling and almost hope within these structures. Like when you walk into, like when there's St. Joseph Church here in downtown Lancaster, not the biggest parish. St. Mary's is by far the bigger parish. But when you walk in, there's like a sense of awe and peace when you see the altar in front of you and you see the saints around you. And you can't replace that feeling in like this training room that I'm sitting in now. Like regardless of how many beautiful pictures of St. Teresa I have around me, it doesn't create that same sense of awe and peace that you feel within that structure.
Yeah.
So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, you know, I mean, they should go pick up your book because it is really a wonderful piece for people to be able to draw upon. But if you could share, you know, maybe one experience of where there really was this kind of structural reaction within your journey, and then what was kind of key in creating that for you?
Well, I would say that the you know, I'm just as moved by places like the Sea of Galilee, which is not man-made. I think that's probably the most sort of profound experience I had, because Jesus was there. Jesus saw these things with his own eyes, which is, I'm smiling because it's amazing to me that I can see something that Jesus saw.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think Christians and Catholics, you know, we all believe in Jesus, but the idea that he walked around at a certain place and you could pinpoint where he would have been, like, this is the Sea of Galilee. It's always been the Sea of Galilee. Here's Capernaum. This is what he would have seen. You know, maybe 5 feet from here or 6 feet from here, but he saw this.
Yeah.
Structures, I think that for me, the one that was the most powerful is called the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is where Jesus's tomb is. It's where he died, but also where he rose from the dead. And I had an experience. It was interesting. It's kind of structural and non-structural. When you go into the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, it's built around the Golgotha, which is the hill on which he was crucified. So if you can imagine, it's built around that. And that it also encompasses the tomb, which is not far. And if you know the Gospels, it says the tomb was nearby, and it's very nearby. It's essentially was at the base of the hill. And they have, you know, some things in the Holy Land in terms of authenticity, you know, who knows? But this is authentic. I mean, this goes back to, you know, there were ceremonies there from like 60 AD. So I mean, we're really like 99% sure this is where it happened. Other things we don't know. But in any event, in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, you go inside and there's a little building inside called the Edicule. It's like a church within a church. And this is where the tomb is. And there's a 1st century tomb there. I mean, it's very authentic. In any event, you go in there and there, you know, this is centuries of pilgrims and incense and prayers and chanting. And it's kind of overwhelming. It's kind of the opposite of the Sea of Galilee, which is very, it's just nature, right? I mean, there's a few tiny little churches on the shoreline, but for the most part, it's a lake and it's kind of untouched. So it's kind of the yin and the yang of these kind of holy spaces. But in any event, I was in there once and I did this meditation of imagining Jesus appearing to Mary Magdalene on the first day of Easter, and I realized I'm in where a garden was. I'm in where the garden was, right? She mistook him for a gardener. And in my imagination, the buildings just faded away and I was in a garden. And so it was a very strange moment because it had a lot to do with the building, but by the same token, didn't have a lot to do with the building. You know, and I think different places are holy for different people, right? I mean, the church in Lancaster might leave someone cold who, you know, has never visited before. And you might have a really boring kind of almost functional space where something holy happened. Let's say someone went on a retreat somewhere, or even like a bedroom where something happened, something beautiful like a conversation, right? Or some encounter that it's like a holy space for people. So I think it's what happens there that makes it holy. I also think, you know, to your point, there's something about many people using it that makes it holy. Right? So your office might not feel like that, but let me just say, if your office, let's say we shifted a bit and you moved out of that office and that same space was used every week for faith sharing, you know, by your staff, I would think that when you walk back into it, you know, a couple years later after doing this for a long time, it would feel holy. It would feel like a holy place, even if it was just one picture of Therese on the wall.
I do
So
think
a
it's
lot of it's
also
a lot of
how,
it's kind of the memory of what happened there.
yeah, how people react to the space. I think that's been, like I said before, I took this job. I had spent a lot of time reflecting and walking and praying about if this was the right place for me, and it obviously was. I've been here 7 years, um, but it's also like I always say, like people are like, well, how do you actually interact with God? And it's like, well, it's on that walk where you get this sensation, and you know someone is with you when no one is there. It's a scent, and then I always, I'll disclose this on this video, and I'll publicly, and everybody can. But when we were debating naming this room that I'm in right now, this training room, we had asked staff to think of saints that aligned with our mission. So we got a bunch of suggestions. And then one morning I came into the office, I was first one here, and there was the overwhelming smell of roses in the
Wow.
office for absolutely no reason. And I was like, well, there's
Wow.
the sign, which I could have just said, oh, it's just air freshener, someone's spray air
No,
freshener.
but no, that's beautiful.
It's the kind of stuff that, like, if you aren't paying attention and you aren't willing to see the signs, then you don't see the signs.
Yeah, and I think, yeah, sometimes it happens that way. Sometimes it doesn't, and that's okay. Because
Yeah.
sometimes people say, "Oh, I didn't feel like that," and I don't feel like that. That's okay. God works in other ways. As you were talking, I was thinking there's a retreat house I'd like to go to called Eastern Point Retreat House in Gloucester, Massachusetts. And first time I was there, now it's commonplace for me. But the first time I was there, my retreat director pointed to this tree. Yeah, it's a tree. It's an evergreen tree. And he goes, that tree was very important for me on this retreat that I did. I'd never heard anyone say anything like that. And I was like, what? Like, what do you mean? Well, it turns out he had this kind of prayer experience under this tree. Now, it's a tree. To anyone else, it would be a tree. But to him, it was this holy place. And so I think that's a reminder, again, in Jesuit spirituality about finding God in all things. You can encounter God anywhere, in that yellow, painted office, or the tree in Gloucester, or the Holy Sepulchre, or the Sea of Galilee. Because God's everywhere. God can, kind of connect with you anywhere.
You just have to be open to it, is what I always.
You do. Yeah, you have to be open. You have to be paying attention.
So, I think we've touched on this a little bit, but, to wrap up, first of all, thank you so much for spending so much time with us.
My pleasure.
As we, hopefully find an end to the pandemic, what are you hoping we've learned?
Oh boy, that there are, the value of human life, first of all, the value of taking care of those who are poor and vulnerable, because we see who it affects, and the value of working together for a world that where the common good is more important than individual needs. I think that's really important. We all need certain basic things, and I think that it's a reminder that there's so many of us that don't have it. But I also think that it's up to the individual to sort of draw meaning from the pandemic for himself or herself. Because much better than me saying, here's what you should learn, is what have you learned? And I think it's encouraging people to come up with life lessons based on those things.
Yeah, it's kind of a message just to kind of slow down and touch base with yourself and see where you are at this point. Yeah. What's different from when we started?
Right. Yeah, exactly. What do you have? What values do you have that are different? And I think any self-reflective person should be able to learn something from this experience.
Well, again, thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it. For those of you watching, we'll have these conversations again every 2 weeks with additional people from the local and from the national community. So we'll continue to join us. Thank you.
My pleasure.